What if the difference between understanding something and merely memorizing it isn't about how smart you are, but about how willing you are to look foolish? There's a particular way of thinking that separates those who truly grasp ideas from those who just collect facts like stamps in an album. And the strange thing is, most people spend their entire lives avoiding this way of thinking because it feels uncomfortable, embarrassing even. They choose the comfort of appearing knowledgeable over the discomfort of actually becoming knowledgeable. The average person walks through life, accumulating information the way a magpie collects shiny objects. They read a book, nod along, maybe underline a few sentences, and then move on, feeling satisfied. They attend a lecture, take notes in neat columns, and file those notes away. They study for an exam by reading the same pages over and over until the words become familiar patterns. And they wonder why, months later, nothing remains. Why the ideas that seemed so clear have evaporated like morning fog. Here's what happens in that common approach. The brain treats understanding like a spectator sport. Information comes in, gets sorted into existing mental categories, and sits there waiting to be recalled. It's passive, it's safe, and it's almost completely useless for genuine learning. When someone reads a textbook chapter and thinks they understand it because the sentences made sense as their eyes passed over them, they've confused familiarity with comprehension. The words felt comfortable because they fit into vague notions already in the mind. But ask them to explain the concept to someone else, or to apply it to a new situation, and watch the confidence crumble. The thinking pattern that changes everything starts with a simple question. Can you explain this to someone who knows nothing about it? Not, can you repeat the explanation you just heard? Not, can you parrot back the author's words? But can you, using your own understanding, reconstruct the idea from the ground up? This is where most people discover they've been fooling themselves. Let's say you've just finished reading a chapter about how engines work. You closed the book feeling pretty good. The diagrams made sense. The descriptions were clear. But now, imagine someone walks into the room and asks you to explain it to them without looking at the book. Suddenly, gaps appear everywhere. Wait, how exactly does the piston connect to the crankshaft? What was the sequence of events in the combustion cycle again? You thought you understood, but you were really just following someone else's understanding. The way you might follow a guided tour through a museum. You saw everything, but you couldn't lead the tour yourself. This reveals the first principle. Understanding lives in reconstruction, not recognition. When you can rebuild an idea using only what's in your head, when you can draw the diagram from memory or walk through the logic step by step without notes, that's when you actually possess the knowledge. Everything else is borrowed clothing that you're trying to pass off as your own. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. To test whether you can reconstruct something, you have to try. And trying means risking failure. It means sitting with a blank piece of paper and attempting to draw that engine diagram, knowing you might get it wrong. It means explaining the concept out loud to an imaginary student, stumbling over the parts you don't really understand. Most people avoid this because watching yourself fail, even in private, triggers something primal. The brain recoils from it. So instead, they reread the chapter. They review their notes. They do anything except confront the actual gaps in their understanding. The second principle follows naturally. Confusion is the compass. When you start trying to explain something and feel that fog of uncertainty rolling in, when you reach for a concept and can't quite grasp it, that's not a sign you're doing it wrong. That's the signal you've found where the real learning needs to happen. The average person feels that confusion and backs away, returns to the comfortable feeling of reading words that make sense. But that confusion is marking the exact location where understanding hasn't yet formed. Think about what happens when someone learns to solve a type of mathematical problem. They watch the teacher do one on the blackboard. It looks straightforward. Then they try one themselves and get stuck immediately. The natural response is frustration, maybe even panic. But that moment of being stuck is the moment when learning can actually occur. Not before, when everything looked easy from the audience. Not after, when they've memorized the steps. Right there, in the middle of confusion, when the mind is wrestling with something it doesn't yet grasp. The difference is whether you see that confusion as failure or as information. If it's failure, you avoid it. If it's information, you lean into it. You ask, what exactly am I confused about? Is it this concept or that one? Where does my understanding break down? And then you go back to that specific thing, not to reread everything, but to rebuild your understanding of that particular piece. Here's the third principle, and it's perhaps the most counterintuitive. You must be willing to sound stupid to yourself. When you're trying to explain something, you're learning, and you hear yourself saying things that sound vague or circular or just plain wrong, the instinct is to stop, to feel embarrassed, even though you're alone, to think, this is pointless, I don't know what I'm talking about. But that voice of yourself sounding uncertain, struggling for words, making mistakes in your reasoning, that's the sound of learning happening in real time. Compare two students. The first reads the chapter on thermodynamics, nods along, highlights key sentences, and feels satisfied. The second reads the same chapter, then closes the book and tries to explain the concept of entropy to an empty chair. They stumble. They backtrack. They realize they're using words without really knowing what they mean. So they open the book again. But this time, they're not reading to feel comfortable. They're reading to answer specific questions that emerged from their failed explanation. Then they try again and again. After an hour, the first student has read the chapter 3 times and feels confident. The second student has only gone through it once and a half, but has tried to explain it 5 times, each attempt getting clearer. 6 months later, ask them both about entropy. The first student will give you fragments of sentences they once highlighted. The second will be able to have a conversation about it. This is because the brain doesn't store information the way a filing cabinet stores papers. It stores it as connections, as pathways. Reading creates weak pathways. Recognizing information when you see it again strengthens those pathways slightly. But actively reconstructing information, forcing the brain to pull together pieces and build the idea fresh, that creates highways. The more times you rebuild something in your mind, the stronger those connections become. Eventually, the knowledge isn't something you have to retrieve. It's something you can simply use, like a language you speak fluently, rather than translate word by word. Now, there's a deeper mechanism at work here that explains why this method is so powerful. The brain is constantly making predictions about what comes next. When you read a sentence, your brain is predicting the next word before you see it. When you watch a demonstration, your brain is predicting the next step. These predictions happen unconsciously, automatically. And here's the key: learning happens most efficiently when predictions are wrong. If you're just reading and everything confirms what you expected, minimal learning occurs. The brain says, yes, this fits what I already know, and moves on. But when you try to explain something and discover you predicted wrong, you thought this concept led to that conclusion, but it doesn't. You thought you understood this relationship, but you don't. That's when the brain pays attention. That's when it actually rewrites the mental model. This is why testing yourself is so much more effective than reviewing. Not because tests are magical, but because tests force predictions. You have to predict the answer before you see it. You have to commit to what you think is true. And when you're wrong, the gap between what you predicted and what's actually correct creates the conditions for genuine learning. Reviewing just shows you things you already saw. Testing shows you where your understanding diverges from reality. Let's bring this into practical territory. Say you're learning about electrical circuits. The textbook shows you how current flows, how resistance works, what happens when you add components in series versus parallel. You read it carefully. Now, here's what separates two approaches. The common approach: you read the section on parallel circuits. It makes sense. You look at the diagrams, they're clear. You move on to the next section, feeling you've learned it. A week later, someone asks you why adding resistors in parallel decreases total resistance, and you know you read about this, but the explanation won't come. You remember it had something to do with pathways, but the details are fog. The uncommon approach: you read about parallel circuits. Then you close the book and draw a parallel circuit from memory. Can you? Maybe partially. You try to explain out loud why the total resistance decreases. You start with, because there are more paths, but then you realize you're just using words. What does more paths actually mean for the electrons? You're not sure. So you open the book again, but now you're not reading passively. You're reading to understand this specific thing about paths and resistance. You find it. It clicks. You close the book again and try the explanation once more. This time you get further. You draw the diagram again, this time adding the details of current division. Each time you try and fail, you identify exactly what you don't understand. Each time you return to the material, you're targeting those specific gaps. After several cycles of this, something changes. The concept isn't something you know in the sense of having read it. It's something you can think with. When you encounter a new circuit problem, you don't have to recall what the book said. You can reason through it using the understanding you've built. This takes longer in the moment. That's why most people don't do it. They can read a chapter in 30 minutes, and that feels productive. Trying to explain it to themselves, stumbling, going back, trying again, that might take an hour or more for the same material. But here's what they miss. The 30-minute reading needs to be repeated multiple times for anything to stick, and even then, it often doesn't. The hour of active reconstruction creates understanding that lasts. You spend more time once, but you don't have to keep relearning the same thing. There's also a social dimension to this that most people overlook. We're terrified of looking stupid in front of others, so we wait until we're sure we understand something before we try to explain it. But this is backwards. Explaining something to another person while you're still figuring it out is one of the most powerful learning tools available. Not explaining it perfectly, explaining it messily, with gaps, with mistakes, while the other person asks questions that expose what you don't understand yet. Picture two people working through a challenging book together. They don't take turns presenting polished summaries of what they've read. Instead, they read a section, then immediately start talking about it, trying to make sense of it together. Wait, I don't understand why that follows from what was said before. Let me try to put this in different words and you tell me if it makes sense. They're not afraid to sound confused because they're stick, both confused. And through the process of articulating their confusion, asking questions, challenging each other's half-formed explanations, they build understanding together in a way neither could alone. This is the opposite of how most studying happens, which is solitary, silent, and focused on feeling certain rather than exploring uncertainty. People study alone because they don't want others to see them struggle. They review silently because speaking feels silly. They seek the feeling of certainty because uncertainty is uncomfortable, and in doing so, they avoid the very conditions that create real learning. Here's what this all points to. The quality of your understanding is directly proportional to your willingness to expose its weaknesses. If you only engage with material in ways that let you maintain the feeling of comprehension, you'll never develop genuine comprehension. You have to be willing to test yourself when you're likely to fail. To explain things when your explanation will be clumsy. To ask questions that reveal what you don't know. This feels inefficient because it involves so much stumbling and backtracking. But it's the only way to build knowledge that lasts, an understanding that's truly yours. The path to average thinking is paved with comfortable feelings of understanding. You read, you nod, you highlight, you feel like you're learning. And maybe you are. In the weakest sense, you're becoming familiar with ideas. But familiarity isn't understanding. Understanding is what happens when you've struggled with an idea enough times that it becomes part of how you think, not just something you think about. So here's the challenge. Take whatever you're trying to learn right now and explain it. Not to me, not to anyone in particular. Just explain it out loud, or write it out on paper, as if you were teaching it to someone who knows nothing about the subject. Don't look at your notes. Don't peek at the book. Just try. And when you get stuck, not if, when, don't judge yourself for it. That's the point. The sticking point is the learning point. That's where you need to direct your attention, where you need to go back to the source material, not to reread everything, but to understand that specific thing you couldn't explain. Do this enough times, and something remarkable happens. You stop being a passive receiver of information and become an active builder of understanding. The difference isn't subtle. It's the difference between someone who's read about swimming and someone who can swim, between someone who's studied maps of a city and someone who knows their way around. between appearing knowledgeable and being capable of thought. The truth is, most people will never think this way because it requires abandoning the comfort of feeling smart for the discomfort of discovering you're not as smart as you thought, at least not yet. But for those willing to look foolish to themselves, willing to expose the gaps in their understanding, willing to rebuild ideas rather than just recognize them, thinking becomes something else entirely, not a performance of intelligence, but an actual tool for understanding the world. That's the choice, really. Stay comfortable with borrowed understanding, or get uncomfortable building your own. The first keeps you average, the second changes everything.